October 15, 1553, Benin City. The air is thick with heat, iron, and the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. In the early morning haze, the walls of Benin glowed with a dull orange tint, baked clay rising tall and proud, the longest continuous earthworks in the world. Beyond them, palms swayed over moats that shimmered like molten bronze. Inside the royal compound, blacksmiths hammered rhythmically, sparks leaping from anvils. The kingdom was alive, breathing industry and power. At the city's western gate, a group of European traders, Portuguese mostly, waited uneasily beside their ship's translator. They had been to many ports along the African coast, Elmina, Lagos, and the Bites. But none of them had seen anything like Benin. Captain Duarte Pires, a seasoned trader for the Crown of Portugal, adjusted his lace collar and squinted toward the fortress walls. "They say the Aba has his own cannon," he muttered, half amused, half skeptical. "Impossible. Who in this jungle has furnaces to melt bronze?" The translator, a young Afro-Portuguese man named Mateo, smiled faintly. "Sir, you may find that Benin is not the jungle you imagine." A distant boom cut through the conversation. The traders froze. Another roar followed, deep, metallic, and thunderous, echoing across the plain. It was no drum, no signal fire. It was a cannon. Pires felt his stomach tighten. Sweet Mother of God! From atop the wall, plumes of white smoke unfurled as Benin soldiers loaded and fired again. Their weapons weren't European imports. The barrels gleamed with ornate carvings, figures of leopards, serpents, and royal insignia. They weren't relics of trade, they were creations. Within the royal foundry, Aba Ezegi's master smith, Igbomer, oversaw the firing process. The forge roared hotter than the noon sun, bellows driven by dozens of men. Molds lined the floor, carved in clay and sand, filled with molten bronze. Igbomer's voice carried through the smoke. "The Aba's enemies carry iron from across the sea. We answer with iron of our own." Benin's cannons were cast using the same mastery that produced the kingdom's famous bronzes, the plaques, statues, and heads that captured centuries of royal lineage. The knowledge came from a blend of tradition and adaptation. The Portuguese had introduced firearms in trade decades earlier, but Benin's metallurgists had already mastered brass and bronze long before contact. They studied, observed, and innovated. By mid-morning, the European delegation was escorted into the royal courtyard, vast, shaded, lined with carved ivory tusks. Aba Ezegi sat upon his throne, robed in coral and silk. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a man who had read the future and prepared for it. He greeted the traders not as subjects, but as equals. "You bring metal and fire," he said through an interpreter. "We too can shape metal and command fire." Captain Pires bowed, unsure whether to be impressed or frightened. His mind wrestled with what he had seen. European traders had long viewed African kingdoms as rich in gold, but poor in craft. Yet here, deep in the forest, was a civilization that had mastered bronze casting, urban planning, and military engineering centuries before their arrival. Ezegi leaned forward slightly. "Tell your king that Benin does not beg for iron. We build our own." Outside, the cannons thundered once more, shaking the courtyard floor. The message was unmistakable. Benin was no passive trading outpost. It was a power, sovereign, disciplined, and unafraid to return fire. As the sun set over the city walls, Captain Pires stood on the ramparts, staring down at the moat glimmering beneath him. He could still hear the echo of those cannons. Somewhere in his gut, he knew this would change how Europe saw Africa forever, though centuries later, many would try to forget this day ever happened. The night after the demonstration, the Portuguese traders were given rare permission to tour Benin's royal foundry. It sat near the eastern edge of the city, where the air shimmered with heat from the furnaces and the smell of charcoal hung heavy. The sound was relentless, metal striking metal, the rhythmic breathing of the forge, and men chanting to keep tempo as they worked. Captain Pires followed Igbomer, the Oba's chief metallurgist, through a corridor lit by flickering torches. Every few steps, he stopped to watch, men turning bellows in perfect coordination, molten bronze pouring from clay crucibles, sparks dancing like fireflies in the night air. "These molds," Pires said, running a finger near one without touching, "they look like the same used for your bronzes?" Igbomer nodded, his voice calm and deliberate. The same hands that cast our kings in bronze now cast weapons to protect their throne. He gestured toward a large pit furnace surrounded by apprentices. We use copper and tin for strength, zinc for color, and lead for smoothness. We melt it here, mix it here, and pour here. He pointed as each process unfolded with clockwork precision. When the metal cools, it remembers its shape, and our ancestors guide it. Pyres watched as two young workers carefully lifted a solidified cannon mold from its frame. The piece was short but thick, its surface engraved with geometric patterns. It gleamed gold under the torchlight. He had seen European foundries back home, but the ritual here, the chanting, the patience, the artistry, gave the process something sacred. "What do you call this?" Pyres asked. Igbomer smiled slightly. "We call it Ego Ogun, the voice of war." He took a hammer and struck the cooled barrel once. The sound rang pure and deep, echoing through the compound. "If the sound sings clearly, it will fire true," he said. "If it does not, we melt it again." Nothing leaves this place that cannot speak with strength. Outside, a group of Benin soldiers trained with muskets and small hand cannons. The Oba's commanders were no strangers to European tactics. Through decades of cautious diplomacy, Benin had studied the trade weapons, copied their designs, and even improved on them. Their fortifications, earthen walls, moats, and wooden towers were planned with deliberate symmetry, each section angled for defense and counterattack. But the real innovation was the integration of metallurgy with traditional warfare. The Edo people saw no line between art and engineering. Every cannon was a work of art. Every plaque told a story of conquest or resistance. Pyres turned to Igbomer again. "You could sell these cannons to the Portuguese crown. They would pay dearly." The smith looked at him, amused, "and trade away our protection." "No, my friend, these are not for sale. They are for Benin." From across the yard, Mateo the translator, overheard and translated softly for Pyres. "He says the kingdom trades in honor, not dependence." That night, Pyres returned to his quarters, shaken and thoughtful. He wrote in his journal, "This land is not as we were told. The Benin are not savages, but craftsmen of the highest order. Their city rivals Lisbon in organization, their walls surpass our forts, and their metal sings when struck." He sealed the note, intending to send it back to Lisbon with the next ship. But as history would have it, few of these testimonies would survive. The image of Africa that Europe preferred was one of weakness and need, not mastery. Still, the truth burned bright in that foundry. Every flare of molten bronze told a story of sovereignty, of a people who refused to be defined by foreign eyes. And in the years that followed, when Benin's cannons defended its borders and its art flooded European museums, the echoes of those fires would continue to haunt the memory of those who first witnessed them. By 1580, the legend of Benin's foundries had spread along the West African coast. European captains whispered about it in ports from Luanda to Snow Tome. Stories of a forest kingdom that could build its own weapons and fire back with European strength. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others, who had seen the city's bronze glow at dusk, knew better. One humid morning that year, a Portuguese vessel anchored near Uatan, Benin's main port. Its mission was to demand trade concessions that favored Lisbon. The traders came armed, confident that the display of muskets and cannon fire would bend the Oba's will. They had done this in other coastal towns, forcing agreements through intimidation, but Benin was different. When the Portuguese envoy marched inland under a flag of negotiation, they found the road lined with Benin soldiers, men in coral armor, their spears tipped with polished iron, their muskets resting on carved wooden stands. In the distance, the moats glinted under the morning sun, and above the walls, bronze cannons waited in silence. The envoy's leader, Captain João da Silva, raised a hand. "We come to trade, not to fight," he announced through his interpreter. The response came from the fortress wall, carried by the wind. "Then speak as traders, not conquerors." Tension thickened the air. The Europeans' hands hovered near their holsters. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, a musket discharged. No one could say from which side, and chaos broke loose. The first Portuguese cannon roared, sending smoke billowing across the clearing. The ball slammed into Benin's wall, but only left a shallow mark. Moments later, the Benin fortress answered. A thunderous boom shattered the air, not with a European cannon, but one forged within the kingdom's own foundry. The shot was precise. It tore through the Portuguese front line, splintering wood and sending men scrambling. A second and third blast followed, the timing perfect. The smoke cleared just long enough for Da Silva to glimpse the impossible. Benin's artillerymen, bare-chested, focused, moving in disciplined rhythm, were loading with tools of their own make. They were using weapons built by their smiths, with gunpowder they had refined themselves. By midday, the battle had ended. The Portuguese, stunned and disoriented, retreated to the coast. Many had believed Africa incapable of such military coordination, such mastery of craft. What they found instead was a civilization that had not only matched their firepower, but exceeded it in precision and artistry. When Oba Ezegi's messengers rode to the coast later that week, they carried no trophies, only a message written on palm leaf parchment. Benin welcomes friendship, not fear. Tell your kings that the world is wide, and power does not sail only from the west. The surviving Portuguese captain, Da Silva, returned home humiliated. In his report to the crown, he tried to rationalize the defeat. Perhaps the metal was of European origin, he wrote. Perhaps the cannons had been stolen. But the truth gnawed at him. He had seen the foundry smoke with his own eyes, heard the rhythm of hammers forging what Europe claimed was impossible. In the years that followed, Benin continued to thrive as one of Africa's most formidable city-states, its artisans producing art so intricate that centuries later, Western scholars would struggle to explain it without conceding genius. But in the 16th century, when smoke rose from the city walls and cannons roared against invaders, Benin had already declared what history would take centuries to admit. Africa was not waiting to be civilized, it was already forging its own destiny, in fire, bronze, and the unyielding will of its people. If stories like this challenge what you thought you knew about history, share this video. Let more people learn the truth about the civilizations that shaped the world long before colonial maps tried to erase them. Subscribe for more hidden chapters of African power, resistance, and genius.